I jolted awake to the sound of my dog Max barking, sharp and panicked, cutting through the thick veil of sleep. My heart slammed into my ribs, and I sat up so fast, I nearly slipped off the couch. The clock on the wall read 2:13 a.m., and the house, bathed in darkness, suddenly felt like a strange and unfamiliar place. Max never barked like that. It wasn't his usual deep, lazy woof that he'd give if he saw a squirrel or the mailman during the day. This was different, raw, and full of fear. I could practically feel the distress vibrating through the walls. My mind went into overdrive, conjuring horrible images of my dog injured or trapped somewhere. Had he gotten hurt? Was he in pain? I stumbled off the couch, my socked feet landing with a muffled thud on the hardwood floor. As I moved toward the hallway, another sound followed. A dull thump, like something heavy had dropped or been knocked over in one of the back rooms. I froze mid-step, a chill creeping up my spine. Max barked again, frantic and desperate, followed by the faintest rustling of movement that didn't sound like it belonged to him. Suddenly, it hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone was in the house. My breath came faster, and I tried to steady myself, to think clearly. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, an old metal flashlight from the end table by the couch. Its weight felt reassuring in my hand, but I wasn't sure if I'd have the guts to use it. I swallowed hard, feeling my pulse thrum in my ears, and made my way cautiously toward the noise, flashlight raised like some flimsy weapon. "Max," I whispered, my voice barely audible, thick with fear. Silence answered me, which was almost worse than the barking. I edged my way down the hallway, every step feeling painfully loud. My mind raced, cataloging the stupid things I'd never thought to prepare for, like keeping a bat by the door or locking my bedroom door at night. Another rustle came from the end of the hall, and I could hear someone, or something, breathing. A muffled shuffle followed, like a footstep trying to be quiet, but failing. My grip on the flashlight tightened until my knuckles ached. The door to my bedroom was half open, a thin sliver of light spilling out where I'd left a lamp on. The shadows shifted as if someone was moving around inside. My heart pounded even harder, and I forced myself to take another step, then another, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. Suddenly, Max appeared in the hallway, his paws skidding on the floor as he came to a stop in front of me. Relief flooded through me, only to evaporate when I saw his body posture. His hackles were raised, and his teeth bared, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. He wasn't barking anymore. He was staring down the hallway, toward the open bedroom door, and I could feel the tension radiating off him. "Good boy," I whispered, though my voice trembled. Max stayed still, as if waiting for a command, his body taut with fear and readiness. I knew I had to make a decision, to act. My brain screamed at me to run, to get out and call for help, but something inside me wouldn't let me abandon my own home without at least knowing what, or who, was inside. I crept forward, Max sticking close to my side. The air felt thick, suffocating. As I reached the door, I could hear the shuffling noises more clearly. Drawers opening and closing, the distinct sound of items being moved around. I knew then that it wasn't just my imagination. There was a burglar in my bedroom, rummaging through my things like they had all the time in the world. Summoning every ounce of courage I didn't know I had, I pushed the door open wider, the old hinges creaking. The noise was loud and jarring, and the rustling inside stopped abruptly. My flashlight beam wavered as I stepped into the room, illuminating the figure of a man hunched over my dresser. He turned, his face masked and his eyes wide with shock. For a split second, we locked eyes, both of us frozen. both of us realizing how real this moment was. Max broke the silence with a deep, furious bark, and the intruder lunged toward the window. My body moved on autopilot, and I swung the flashlight hard, clipping his shoulder. He stumbled, cursing, and crashed through the window, shattering glass everywhere as he disappeared into the night. The house fell silent again, except for the sound of my ragged breathing and Max's growls fading into low whimpers. I stood there, the flashlight still clutched in my shaking hand, realizing how close I'd come to something far worse than a simple burglary. Max pressed his body against me, and I sank to the floor, wrapping my arms around him, grateful he'd woken me up. Outside, the wind carried away the fading echo of broken glass, and I silently thanked whatever instinct had made me brave enough to protect the only home I had. The phone call had came in suddenly on the radio, but there was no voice, only the sound of someone breathing. I stared at the radio, my hand frozen over the receiver. It was my third night on duty since graduating from the academy, and I was still getting used to the rhythm of the graveyard shift. My training officer, Sergeant Willis, was snoring softly in the driver's seat, head leaned back, mouth open, utterly unaware of the call that had just come through. I hesitated, hoping the call would repeat, maybe with clearer audio. But the only sound was the static hum of the dashboard radio and Willis's rhythmic breathing. "Willis," I whispered, nudging his arm. His eyes snapped open, and he straightened up, blinking the sleep from his eyes. "What?" he asked, irritated. "Dispatch came through," I said. "But I don't know. It was weird." Willis groaned, clearly annoyed. "Weird how?" "It was just breathing," I replied. "Heavy breathing, no talking." He rubbed his eyes, groggy but interested now. "Location?" I glanced at the screen, where the coordinates glowed a dull green. My stomach twisted. "Abandoned precinct," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Everyone knew about the old precinct on Baxter Street, closed down 20 years ago after a fire claimed the lives of 3 officers trapped inside. People said you could still hear them screaming at night. I didn't believe in ghost stories, or at least, I tried not to. But hearing that heavy breathing come from that place made my skin crawl. Willis raised an eyebrow, a flicker of discomfort crossing his weathered face. But he was an old cop, hardened by years of stories and truths that would make anyone jumpy. "All right," he sighed, reaching for the ignition. "Let's check it out. Protocol." We pulled up to the building, our headlights cutting through the dense fog that seemed to wrap around the structure like a second skin. The old police station loomed, battered and blackened from the fire, windows shattered and boarded up. Even in the dark, the burn marks looked fresh. Willis killed the engine, and for a moment, the silence was suffocating. The wind whispered through the broken windows, sounding like faint, ghostly murmurs. My heart thudded in my chest as I unfastened my seatbelt. Every fiber of my being screamed that we shouldn't be here. "Grab the flashlight," Willis ordered, his voice low. I fumbled for it, hands trembling. The beam of light felt weak, barely making a dent in the surrounding darkness as we approached the building. The front door hung off its hinges, groaning as it swayed in the wind. We stepped inside. The air was heavy, filled with the acrid scent of old, charred wood and something else, something metallic, like blood. I swept the flashlight across the empty lobby, the beam catching on scorched police badges scattered across the floor. It looked like a memorial, hastily abandoned. "Hello?" Willis called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. No response, only the sound of breathing, closer now, wet and rasping. I whipped the flashlight around, and my heart stopped. For just a moment, I swore I saw a shadow move, shaped like a person, but wrong. Its limbs were distorted, and its head hung at an unnatural angle. But then, it was gone, leaving only the breath, louder now, echoing all around us. Willis turned to me, and his eyes were wide, the bravado gone. "We're not alone," he whispered. Then, the doors slammed shut behind us. The flashlight flickered, and the breathing turned into a chorus of gasps, like a crowd of unseen figures surrounding us. In that moment, I knew the stories were real. The spirits of the fallen officers were still here, trapped, and now so were we. The first scream cut through the night like a knife, and I nearly dropped my flashlight. We had rented the cabin for a quiet weekend getaway, a break from our exhausting city jobs and the monotony of everyday life. The place was buried deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, with no cell service or nearby neighbors. At the time, the isolation had seemed like a feature, not a flaw. It was our second night there, and we had just finished a round of cards when the scream echoed through the trees. My friends, Alex, Megan, and Danny, froze mid-laugh. The sound was raw and desperate, like someone being torn apart. "What the hell was that?" Megan whispered, her face pale. Danny, always the skeptic, chuckled uneasily. "Probably a coyote or something. They make weird noises at night." But deep down, none of us really believed that. The scream was too human, too real. "Should we check it out?" Alex suggested, but his voice wavered. He was trying to sound brave, but his hands were trembling. I felt a cold sweat trickling down my back. I grabbed the flashlight off the kitchen counter, my fingers brushing against its cold metal. It felt heavier than usual, as if weighed down by the sense of dread creeping over me. "Let's just look around," I said, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to reassure. Maybe someone's in trouble. We stepped outside, the cabin door creaking loudly as it swung shut behind us. The forest was silent, too silent, as if holding its breath. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but something else lingered, a coppery tang that reminded me of rusted metal. I clicked on the flashlight, and the beam cut a narrow path through the blackness. The trees were tall and skeletal, their bare branches reaching out like twisted fingers. Each shadow seemed to move just out of sight, dancing away when the light approached. "Hello?" Alex called, his voice cracking. The only answer was the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. Megan grabbed my arm. "This is a bad idea," she whispered. "We should go back inside." "Yeah, maybe," I began, but I was cut off by another scream. This one was closer, and it was followed by a series of heavy footsteps, crashing through the underbrush. We whipped around, pointing the flashlight toward the noise. The light landed on something, or someone, moving quickly between the trees. For just a second, I saw the outline of a figure, impossibly tall and wrapped in tattered clothing. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, and it disappeared from view almost as soon as I spotted it. "What was that?" Danny hissed, his bravado gone. "Did you see it?" "I don't know," I stammered, but my mind was racing. Every hair on my body was standing on end. We backed up slowly, and I found myself gripping Megan's hand. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and I could feel eyes on us from every direction. Then we heard it. The echo. A voice, distorted and hollow, called out from the darkness. "Help me!" It was faint, like a recording played on an old broken radio. Alex looked at me, his face pale. "That sounded like..." "Me," I finished, my voice shaking. Because the echo wasn't random. It was my voice, pleading for help, even though I hadn't said a word. Danny took off running, sprinting back to the cabin, and the rest of us didn't need any encouragement. We bolted after him, not stopping until we were safely inside, locking every door and window behind us. Our hearts pounded as we huddled together, listening to the silence outside. The rest of the night, we waited, but the screams never came again. We didn't sleep. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we packed up and left without looking back. I'd like to think it was just our imaginations, a trick of the dark and the isolation. But that echo, that desperate voice calling out for help in my own voice, still haunts me. It was as if something in those woods wanted to lure us in, using our own fear against us. I was home alone when I first heard the thud, coming from somewhere deep inside the walls. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. My parents had gone out of town for a wedding, leaving me to watch the house. At 17, I relished the freedom. No curfews, no nagging. Just me, my dog Bailey, and endless hours of movies and junk food. It was around midnight when the noise started. I was sprawled out on the couch, half watching a horror film, the house dark and still around me. Bailey, a shaggy old golden retriever, had fallen asleep on the floor beside me. Then came the sound, a low, heavy thud, muffled but definite, as though something, or someone, had moved inside the walls. Bailey's head snapped up, ears perked. My heart skipped a beat, and I muted the TV, straining to listen. The house settled into silence once more. Maybe it was just the pipes, I told myself, or the old wooden beams creaking. Our house was old, and I was used to its groans and sighs. But then I heard it again. Thud, thud, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Bailey let out a low growl, and the fur on his back bristled. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. "It's nothing," I whispered, more to myself than to Bailey. He wasn't convinced, and honestly, neither was I. Grabbing the nearest thing that could serve as a weapon, a heavy metal flashlight, I stood up and inched toward the hallway. The house felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to have stretched, lengthening and twisting in the corners. "Hello?" I called, immediately regretting it. My voice echoed back at me, small and shaky. The only answer was the sound of my own footsteps, creaking over the hardwood floor. I turned the corner into the kitchen, every muscle in my body tense. That's when I saw it. The basement door, which had been closed earlier, was now ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling out. My throat went dry. We always kept that door locked. Always. I flicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting into the shadows. "Bailey," I whispered, and he was at my side in an instant, his growl deepening. We both stood there, staring at the door. It swayed gently, like it had just been pushed. Something had come up from the basement. Another thud sounded, but this time it was accompanied by a dragging noise, like heavy feet scraping across the floor. It was coming from behind the door, closer now. My hands were shaking so badly that the flashlight beam quivered. I knew I should run, should lock myself in my room and call the police, but my feet felt glued to the spot. I reached for the basement door, heart hammering, and pulled it open the rest of the way. The flashlight illuminated the top of the basement stairs. The smell hit me first, a foul, rotten stench that made me gag. The beam of light trembled over each step, revealing nothing but the dusty wooden stairs, leading down into the pitch-black basement. But the dragging sound continued, echoing up from below. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, I heard a whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, cutting through the silence like a knife. "I've been waiting." Bailey barked furiously, snapping me out of my paralysis. I stumbled backward, slamming the basement door shut and locking it. My hands fumbled as I grabbed my phone and called 911, my voice a frantic whisper as I tried to explain what was happening. The dispatcher stayed on the line until the police arrived, sirens cutting through the night. 2 officers swept the house, checking every room, and then finally descended into the basement. When they came back up, one of them looked pale, almost sick. "Did you say you've been home alone all weekend?" he asked, his voice tense. Yeah, I stammered. He exchanged a glance with his partner. "We found signs that someone's been living down there. Old food wrappers, a sleeping bag, and a pile of tools." My stomach turned. The officer continued. "It looks like whoever it was must have left out the back door when we pulled up. You're lucky you locked that door when you did." Lucky. The word felt bitter in my mouth, because now, whenever I'm home alone, I can't help but wonder if the uninvited guest is still out there, waiting for another chance. Working the night shift at Walmart was usually boring, but that night, something in aisle 19 wouldn't stop whispering. I was midway through stacking boxes of canned soup onto a shelf when I first heard it, a faint, scratchy whisper. I paused, the can in my hand hovering in the air, and strained to listen. At first, I thought it was just the store's old sound system malfunctioning again. But the whisper was clear, almost conversational, like 2 people having a hushed argument. "Hey, Matt," I called to my coworker, who was pricing cereal boxes in the next aisle over. "You hear that?" He poked his head around the corner, raising an eyebrow. "Hear what?" I hesitated. The whispering had stopped. The store was dead silent again, save for the humming of the fluorescent lights and the distant buzz of the automatic floor cleaner in the back. "Never mind," I muttered, feeling a little silly. Matt gave me a look but went back to his work. I sighed, placing the can on the shelf and reaching for another. That's when I heard it again, only louder this time, definitely coming from aisle 19. "Come find us!" I shivered. The voice was scratchy, almost as if it were coming through a radio tuned to the wrong frequency. I glanced around, hoping to see a prankster, maybe one of the Night Stalk crew having a laugh at my expense. But aisle 19 was empty. I didn't want to be the guy who got spooked by a whisper, so I squared my shoulders and marched over, gripping my box cutter a little tighter than necessary. The shelves in aisle 19 were lined with the usual assortment of toys and kids' games. Action figures and dolls sat silently in their packaging, waiting for some child to bring them to life. The whisper returned, louder and almost playful. "We're here. Don't be afraid." The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I swung the flashlight I kept on my belt, casting its beam over the shelves. The light caught on the glassy eyes of a row of dolls, their painted faces frozen in eerie grins. One of the dolls, a porcelain thing with a frilly dress and curls, seemed to be staring right at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been facing this way a moment ago. "All right, very funny," I said, my voice sounding more nervous than I intended. "Whoever's doing this, knock it off." The whisper was gone. Instead, there was a giggle, a child's laugh, echoing softly through the aisle. My stomach twisted, and I spun around, expecting to see someone, anyone, standing there. But there was only Matt, coming around the corner with a confused expression. "Dude, you okay?" he asked. I swallowed, my mouth dry. "Did you hear a laugh just now?" Matt frowned. "No, but I'm hearing you talk to yourself, which is weird enough." I rubbed the back of my neck, trying to play it off. Yeah, must be my imagination. Night shift is getting to me. He shrugged and went back to stocking shelves. I tried to do the same, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I continued working, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that porcelain doll had moved again. An hour later, things were quiet, and I started to think maybe I had imagined it. But then, as I was organizing some bins in the stockroom, I found something that made my blood run cold. A trail of tiny, child-sized footprints tracked across the dusty floor, leading toward the emergency exit. The prints were smudged, as if someone, or something, had been shuffling. And beside them, a single porcelain doll lay on the ground, face up, with a cracked smile. Before I could react, the lights in the stockroom flickered, and I heard the whisper one last time, right next to my ear. "You found us, but we're not done playing." I ran out of there so fast I nearly tripped, leaving the doll and my courage behind. I still work the night shift at Walmart, but I never go near aisle 19 alone, because whatever is in there, it's still waiting, and I don't think it likes to lose. The first time I saw the red lantern glowing in the woods, I told myself it was a trick of the light. My girlfriend Sarah and I had rented the cabin for a week, hoping to escape our hectic city lives. The cabin was a picturesque 2-story wooden home, tucked away in a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed endless. During the day, the scenery was breathtaking, but when night fell, a suffocating darkness settled over everything. It was our third night there when I first saw it. We were sitting on the front porch, sipping hot cocoa and enjoying the cool, crisp air. The moon was mostly hidden behind a thick cover of clouds, leaving only our small porch light to push back the darkness. That's when something caught my eye. A red glow, faint but unmistakable, deep within the woods. Sarah noticed my expression and followed my gaze. "What's that?" she asked, leaning forward. I squinted. The glow seemed to be moving, swaying gently, like someone carrying a lantern. "Probably just a hunter," I said, but the unease in my voice betrayed me. It was odd, seeing a light like that in the middle of nowhere. It was too late for hunting, and we hadn't seen another soul since we arrived. The light hovered for a moment, then disappeared. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. Sarah frowned but didn't press the issue, and we went back inside, locking the door behind us. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the red lantern burned in my mind. Around 2 a.m., I gave up on trying to rest and got up to get a glass of water. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind brushed against it, and shadows danced in the corners, making the place feel more alive than it should. As I drank, I glanced out the kitchen window and nearly dropped my glass. The lantern was back, glowing brighter now, just beyond the tree line. My heart raced. This time, I was sure it was closer. I couldn't make out who was holding it, but the way it moved was unsettling. It swayed from side to side, almost rhythmically, like it was beckoning me. "Hey," Sarah's sleepy voice startled me. She stood in the kitchen doorway, rubbing her eyes. "What are you doing?" I gestured to the window. "That light. It's back. Look." She stepped up beside me, but when she peered outside, the lantern was gone. Her eyes narrowed. "You sure you're not just imagining things?" she asked, her tone playful but concerned. "I'm sure," I said, my voice firm. But even as I said it, doubt began to creep in. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was letting the isolation get to me. The next day, we decided to hike a trail near the cabin, hoping fresh air and sunlight would settle my nerves. The woods were beautiful during the day, filled with the scent of pine and the sound of birdsong. But as we ventured deeper, we stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. An old, rusted lantern hung from a low tree branch. The glass was cracked, and the metal frame was splattered with dark, rust-colored stains. It looked abandoned, yet there were fresh footprints in the dirt beneath it. "Who would leave this here?" Sarah murmured, unease creeping into her voice. I didn't have an answer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We cut the hike short, heading back to the cabin in silence. That night, I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the cabin window. It was a soft, deliberate sound, like fingernails drumming on glass. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked at Sarah. She was still asleep, oblivious to the noise. I forced myself out of bed and tiptoed to the window, dreading what I would see. The red lantern was back, floating just a few yards from the cabin, and this time, I could see a figure standing behind it. The shape was cloaked in darkness, but its head tilted as if it were studying me, waiting. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, but the figure didn't move. My knees felt weak, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. As I backed away, the light began to drift away from the cabin, slowly fading into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Sarah and I packed our things and left, cutting our trip short. I never told her about the figure I saw. I didn't want to admit how terrified I had been, or that some part of me was afraid we hadn't really escaped. We were transferring a prisoner no one wanted to talk about, and by the end of the night, half the officers had gone missing. The orders came in suddenly. Transfer a high-profile inmate from the county jail to a maximum security prison on the outskirts of the state. My partner, Officer Ramirez, and I were assigned to lead the convoy. We were given minimal details, just that the prisoner, one John D. Wallace, was considered dangerous and had a record longer than anyone cared to read. When I first saw him, he didn't look dangerous. Wallace was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with thin, wispy hair and deep-set eyes that seemed almost empty. But something about him felt wrong. The way he sat in the holding cell, his hands resting calmly on his lap, gave me chills. He didn't seem nervous or angry, just resigned. The sergeant briefed us one last time, making a point to avoid meeting Wallace's gaze. "Keep your eyes forward. Don't engage with him. And under no circumstances let him out of your sight." His voice was tight, his face pale. The transfer began without a hitch. Wallace was cuffed and shackled, seated in the back of our armored van, with Ramirez and me sitting up front. 2 more squad cars flanked us, one in front and one behind. The evening sky was thick with clouds, and a mist clung to the road, making everything feel claustrophobic. We drove in silence for about 20 minutes when Wallace spoke for the first time. His voice was soft, almost polite. "Did they tell you what I am?" he asked. Ramirez shot me a look. We'd been told not to engage, but something about Wallace's tone felt almost hypnotic. Against my better judgment, I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He was smiling, his teeth yellowed and crooked. "No," I replied, keeping my voice even. "And we don't care." He chuckled, a low, rasping sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You should care," he said. "You see, they never did figure it out. What I am, what I can do." Ramirez rolled his eyes, trying to play it cool, but I could see the tension in his jaw. "Shut up, old man," he snapped, turning to glare at Wallace. But then, something changed. Ramirez's face went slack, and his eyes glazed over as if he were looking at something horrifying that I couldn't see. "Ramirez?" I said, my voice cracking. He didn't answer. Instead, he unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements stiff, almost puppet-like, and opened the passenger door while we were still speeding down the road. "Ramirez!" I shouted, grabbing for him, but it was too late. He stepped out into the darkness, vanishing into the mist. The van swerved, and I struggled to regain control, my hands trembling. The radio crackled to life, voices from the squad cars shouting about Ramirez's sudden disappearance. "Officer down!" I yelled into the radio, but Wallace only chuckled from the back. "One down," he said. "How many more will it take?" I pulled the van to a stop, breathing hard. The officers from the other cars ran up to me, their faces pale and confused. We searched for Ramirez, but he was gone. Just gone. No body, no sign of struggle, only the lingering mist. "We have to keep going," one of the officers said, panic creeping into his voice. "We can't let him out of our sight." Wallace sat there, his calm demeanor unbroken. "I warned you," he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "I don't kill people. I simply persuade them." We resumed the drive, the silence even heavier now. Every few minutes, I would glance in the rearview mirror, terrified that Wallace would do something else. His eyes met mine, and he tilted his head. "You're strong," he murmured, "but even strength has its limits." A minute later, the officer driving the lead car veered off the road, crashing into a ditch. The driver from the rear car screamed over the radio about shadows moving through the mist, whispering his name. Panic set in. We were losing control, losing officers one by one, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Wallace watched it all, his gaze knowing, almost hungry. "Please," I begged, breaking the rule of engagement. "What do you want?" His smile widened. "Just a little company," he whispered. We finally reached the prison gates, but only 2 of us remained. Half the convoy was gone, swallowed up by the mist, never to be seen again. Wallace was taken into the facility, his hands still shackled, and he looked back at me one last time. "See you soon," he said, and I knew it wasn't a promise. It was a certainty. The first time I saw the dollhouse in the attic, it was an exact replica of our home, down to the broken porch light. My parents had just moved us into a creaky old Victorian house, the kind that loomed over the neighborhood with peeling paint and ivy strangling its sides. My mom called it a fixer-upper, but to me, it looked haunted from day one. I was unpacking boxes in my room when I found it. A little wooden staircase tucked into the wall behind a loose panel. I couldn't resist climbing up to explore, flashlight in hand, the beam bouncing off cobwebs and dust motes. The attic was musty and cluttered, filled with forgotten furniture and old trunks. But the thing that caught my eye was a dollhouse, sitting in the center of the room, perfectly preserved. It was stunningly detailed, a miniature replica of our new home. Each window, door, and creaking floorboard was mirrored in tiny perfection. Even the furniture was identical. I crouched down, brushing off a layer of dust. Someone had spent a lot of time making it, and I wondered who it had belonged to. "Creepy," I muttered, but I couldn't deny the craftsmanship. I reached in to adjust a tiny chair in the living room, and that's when I noticed something strange. There were tiny dolls, too. One for each member of our family, Mom, Dad, and me. The doll that represented me had short brown hair, just like mine, and wore the same blue sweater I had on. Okay, that's unsettling, I whispered, backing away. I hurried downstairs, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I woke up to a noise, a soft, tapping sound coming from above. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, listening. It was coming from the attic, slow and rhythmic, like someone gently knocking on the floorboards. I held my breath, willing the sound to stop, but it only grew louder. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, its glow casting shadows over my bedroom. The tapping ceased abruptly, replaced by silence so thick I could almost hear my own heartbeat. I tried to tell myself it was just the old house settling. In the morning, I tried to forget about it, but the unease wouldn't leave me. I decided to go back up to the attic, just to prove to myself that it was nothing. The dollhouse sat there, unchanged, but when I peered inside, my stomach knotted. The dolls had moved. My mom's doll was now lying in the miniature kitchen, as if it had fallen over, while Dad's doll stood at the tiny front door, like he was about to leave. My doll was upstairs, in the miniature bedroom, lying flat on the bed, just like me. "Mom?" I called, trying to sound casual as I stumbled back down the attic stairs. "You didn't, mess with anything in the attic, did you?" She frowned at me from the living room, where she was unpacking boxes. "Why would I go up there? It's full of dust and spiders." I didn't have an answer, but the feeling of being watched had returned, stronger now. I tried to brush it off, to go about my day, but every so often, I'd catch the shadows shifting in the corners of my vision, like someone was moving just out of sight. That night, it got worse. I woke up again, this time to the feeling of something heavy pressing against my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, and in the darkness, I swore I heard tiny footsteps running across the floor. The weight lifted, and I sat up gasping, heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted up to the attic. The dollhouse was waiting, as if it knew I'd be back. I shone the light into the little rooms, and my stomach turned. My doll was now standing at the attic entrance in the miniature version of the house, one tiny hand raised as if knocking. And there was a new doll, a figure that hadn't been there before, a shadowy, faceless figure, standing in the corner of the attic, looming over everything. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floor. I ran downstairs, locking my bedroom door and huddling under my blankets like a child, hoping the feeling of being watched would go away. The next morning, my dad told us he was taking a business trip. "Sudden, but important," he said, smiling. But I noticed the tired lines under his eyes, the way he kept glancing at the ceiling. I couldn't shake the feeling that the dollhouse had known he would leave. The last straw came that night, when I woke to see my bedroom door ajar, even though I knew I had locked it. The sound of tiny footsteps echoed from the hallway, soft and deliberate. I don't go up to the attic anymore. The dollhouse waits, and I know the shadowy figure is still there, growing closer. Because each night, I hear the knocking, gentle, insistent, and I'm terrified that one day, it will come from right outside my bedroom door. It started with light scratching sounds at my front door, the kind that almost makes you think a tree branch is tapping against the wood. The first time I heard it, I dismissed it. I lived alone in a small apartment complex at the edge of town, with only a couple of neighbors I barely knew. It wasn't unusual for the wind to carry branches against the building, or for stray cats to wander by. But that was before I noticed the scratches were forming patterns. On the second night, the noise came again, just after midnight. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was steady, rhythmic, and I found myself unable to sleep, lying in bed with my heart pounding. By the time I worked up the nerve to check, the sound had stopped, and there was nothing outside but the empty corridor. When I looked closer at my door in the morning light, my stomach twisted. There were scratches on the wood, 3 deep lines, and a 4th, shallow one curving around them, almost like a clock, marking 3:15. Below it, scratched with eerie precision, were 3 words: power outage today. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was playing a prank, though I couldn't imagine who. Still, the prediction stuck with me, gnawing at the back of my mind as I went through my day. At 3:15 that afternoon, I was sitting in my living room, phone in hand, when the lights flickered and went out. The whole complex lost power, plunging us into a murky, half-darkness. My mouth went dry. A coincidence, I told myself. It had to be. But the next night, it happened again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. My palms were sweaty as I stood on the other side of the door, the sound echoing through the apartment. I didn't dare open it. When the scratching finally stopped, I waited until morning to look. This time, the scratches marked 5:30, and the message below made my blood run cold. A neighbor will go missing. I was starting to panic. I tried telling myself that it was some sort of sick joke, that there had to be a logical explanation. But when 5:30 came and went, the police were at my neighbor Mrs. Dawson's door, asking if anyone had seen her. She had vanished, her apartment left unlocked, her keys still on the kitchen table. No one knew where she'd gone. By the 3rd night, I was too terrified to sleep. I sat on my couch, gripping a kitchen knife, and watched the door. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It came, just like clockwork, at midnight. I felt tears prick my eyes. The noise seemed to mock me, daring me to confront whatever was behind it. I didn't look at the message until dawn, my hands trembling. The scratches had marked out 7:00, and the prediction was simple yet ominous. You will be chosen. Chosen? For what? My heart raced, and I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any signs of life outside. The hallway was silent, empty. The day dragged on, each tick of the clock sending shivers down my spine. I called in sick to work, unable to think about anything other than the prediction. As the minutes ticked toward 7:00 p.m., I barricaded the door, stacking furniture and clutching the knife with white-knuckled hands. The clock struck 7:00, and nothing happened. I held my breath, the tension building until I thought I might scream. Then, from somewhere deep in the building, I heard it, a scraping sound, not at my door, but from the hallway. The sound of heavy footsteps dragging something across the floor. My phone buzzed, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it. It was a text from an unknown number. You can't hide forever. I stumbled back, the knife slipping from my grip. The scraping grew louder, closer, and I realized the door was vibrating, as if something was trying to get through. That's when the scratching started again, slow and deliberate, marking out something new. My eyes widened, and my voice caught in my throat as I saw the message appear, in real time, carved into the wood. Midnight. Say goodbye. The scratching stopped, and the silence that followed was worse. Midnight was only hours away. Working the night shift at Walmart is usually uneventful, but I'll never forget the night the store lights started going out, one aisle at a time. It was supposed to be a routine night. I was stocking shelves in the toy section, the fluorescent lights humming above me, and the store music looping through its usual dull playlist. The place felt cavernous at night, empty and echoing. Most of the other employees stuck to their own corners of the store, leaving me in relative silence. It was around 2 a.m. when the first light flickered. I glanced up, annoyed. The store had old wiring, so it wasn't unusual. But when the entire row of lights above aisle 5 went dark, with an audible click, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I tried to ignore it, focusing on stacking the new boxes of action figures. Then another aisle went dark. Click. This time it was aisle 6, directly next to me. The darkness seemed thick and unnatural, swallowing up everything past the edge of the flickering light. "Hey, Mike," I called over my shoulder, hoping one of the other night shift workers was close. No answer. Just the creak of the store settling and the distant whir of the floor scrubber on the other side of the building. Click. The lights in aisle 7 went out, plunging me into darkness. Only the dim emergency lights in the distance kept the entire store from being swallowed up. My heart pounded, and I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. "What the hell?" I whispered, stepping cautiously out of the toy section. My phone's beam cut through the shadows, revealing shelves that seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness shifting and almost moving. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a glitch in the electrical system. Maybe. Then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from aisle 10. I swallowed hard, gripping my phone tighter. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing into the void. "Mike, is that you?" The footsteps paused. Then they started again, but this time they were closer. I backed away, nearly tripping over a stack of stuffed animals. The soft laughter of a toy clown, triggered by my stumble, sent a chill down my spine. It sounded distorted, too loud in the otherwise silent store. Click. Aisle 8 went dark, and the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening. The silence was thick, pressing against my ears. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, I heard a whisper. It was so faint I could barely make it out, but it sounded like a child. "Come and play." I spun around, shining my flashlight wildly. The aisles were empty, rows of toys staring back at me with their cold plastic eyes. My legs were shaking, and I debated making a run for the employee break room. Click. Aisle 9 went dark. Only one aisle of light remained, and I was standing in the center of it. The shadows pressed in, feeling closer with every passing second. That's when I saw movement. A figure, tall and unnaturally thin, lurched out from the shadows at the far end of the aisle. Its limbs were too long, bending in ways that made my stomach churn. Its face was blank, smooth like a mannequin's, but I could feel it watching me. The figure tilted its head, as if curious, and took a step forward. My instincts kicked in. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing as I sprinted down the nearest aisle, weaving between displays and barely avoiding a stack of clearance TVs. I burst through the doors into the break room, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I pressed my ear to the door, listening. The footsteps had stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. I slumped against the wall, trying to steady my heartbeat. Then, from the intercom system, a crackling sound burst to life, followed by that same childlike whisper, echoing through the entire store. "I see you." The break room lights flickered. The doorknob rattled, slowly at first, then more violently, as if something was trying to force its way inside. I backed away, my pulse thundering in my ears. Suddenly, the rattling stopped, and the intercom went silent. I was left standing in the middle of the break room, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The only sound was the hum of the vending machine, punctuated by my ragged breaths. Then, from behind me, a faint click. I spun around, but the break room was empty. The vending machine lights flickered, and I noticed, with a sinking feeling, that the shadows under the door were moving. The day I moved into my new apartment, everything seemed perfect. It was the kind of place that felt immediately comforting. High ceilings, big windows that let in plenty of light, and the kind of quiet that made you feel safe. I unpacked my things slowly, savoring the fresh start, the new space, the idea of finally being on my own. But a week in, things started to feel off. It was little things at first, easy enough to brush off as me just being forgetful. I'd come home from work and find the living room chair slightly pulled out from the table, or my coffee mug that I'd left drying by the sink had somehow ended up on the kitchen counter. I told myself I was just tired, distracted. It was easy to believe at first. Then there was the food. I'd make a mental note of the groceries I had, like the unopened box of cereal that suddenly had half its contents missing one morning, or the milk that seemed to be draining faster than I was using it. I shrugged it off, convinced myself that I wasn't paying attention to what I was eating. Maybe I was sleep eating, I joked to myself, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The worst, though, was the night I heard the whispering. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. A soft, muffled voice coming from somewhere in the apartment. My eyes flew open, and I lay there, frozen, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The voice was faint, but it was unmistakably human, drifting up from somewhere deep within the walls. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart raced so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I sat up, straining to listen. The whispering stopped, and the silence felt heavier than ever. I wanted to believe it was just a neighbor, someone with their TV on too loud, or talking on the phone in the next apartment. But something in the back of my mind whispered that it wasn't. The next morning, I did my best to brush off the incident. The sun was shining through my windows, and everything seemed too ordinary to support the fear I'd felt the night before. Still, I couldn't shake the paranoia that crept into the corners of my mind. That evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The closet door in my bedroom, which I always kept firmly closed, was slightly ajar. Just an inch, but enough for me to notice. My stomach clenched, and I slowly approached the door, feeling a cold dread spreading through me. With my heart pounding, I reached for the handle and yanked the door open. The closet was empty, of course, just my clothes hanging neatly on their hangers. I let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously at myself. "Get it together," I whispered. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone, somewhere, was hiding just out of sight. Things only got stranger from there. I'd come home from work to find the bathroom mirror fogged up, as if someone had taken a hot shower. One evening, while I was cooking dinner, I swore I heard footsteps above me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I knew the floor plan of the building, knew that there was no unit above mine. The footsteps stopped when I went to investigate, leaving me standing in my kitchen, clutching a knife and trying to pretend I wasn't terrified. The tipping point came 2 weeks later. I'd installed a cheap security camera in my living room, just for peace of mind. One night, I was at a friend's place when my phone buzzed with an alert. "Motion detected," it said. My stomach flipped, and I opened the app with shaky hands. The live feed popped up, showing the empty living room. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief, until I noticed the shadow. A dark shape moved across the room, creeping low and quiet. My breath hitched, and I watched in horror as a man emerged from the hallway, his face obscured by the shadow. He moved with a practiced silence, heading straight for the fridge. He pulled out the milk, took a long swig, and then wiped his mouth on the back of his hand. He looked around, his head cocked, as if listening for something. My blood ran cold as he turned, and his eyes seemed to fix directly on the camera, though he couldn't possibly know it was there. I dropped my phone, and the screen cracked as it hit the floor. My entire body shook, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. The realization sank in like a stone in my gut. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. The man living in my apartment, hiding somewhere in the walls or the attic, had been there all along. The first night it happened, I was already on edge. My son, Ryan, had been having nightmares again, waking up in the middle of the night and crying until I came to comfort him. It was exhausting, but I didn't blame him. Moving into a new house was hard for a 6-year-old, especially one who was used to the bright lights and constant noise of the city. The countryside, with its silence and long, empty stretches of darkness, was something he hadn't quite adjusted to yet. I'd finally managed to get him back to sleep and was making my way down the creaky staircase when I heard it. A soft, scratching sound coming from somewhere above me. It stopped me dead in my tracks. At first, I thought it must be a mouse or a squirrel in the attic, but it had a rhythm to it, like something, or someone, dragging their nails along the wood. I stood there, one foot hovering over the next step, and held my breath, listening. The sound stopped, and the silence that followed was so absolute that it felt like the whole house was holding its breath with me. I brushed it off, convincing myself that an old house like this was bound to make noises. Exhausted and still half asleep, I went back to bed, determined to blame it on my imagination. But the next night, it happened again. I woke to the sound of Ryan calling out, his voice muffled and scared. I rushed into his room, and he was sitting up in bed, clutching his stuffed dinosaur, tears streaking his cheeks. "The man with the hungry eyes," he whispered, pointing to the ceiling. "He's watching me from the attic." My heart clenched. "Sweetie, there's no one there." I tried to reassure him, though a chill crept up my spine. I checked the attic door in the hallway, making a show of locking it. "See? Nobody can get through." Ryan nodded, but his eyes still lingered on the ceiling, wide and fearful. I stayed with him until he fell back asleep, though it took a long time for his small body to relax. As I made my way back to my room, I told myself it was just a child's overactive imagination. But deep down, I couldn't shake the image he'd put in my head. A man with hungry eyes lurking above us. That night, the scratching was louder. It woke me up around 3 a.m., and this time, it sounded almost purposeful. I listened, wide-eyed in the darkness, as the noise shifted into what sounded like dragging footsteps. The floorboards in the attic creaked and groaned as if someone, or something, was pacing above our heads. Fear gripped me, squeezing the air from my lungs. I forced myself to get up, grabbing the heavy flashlight I kept by my bed. The house felt impossibly still as I crept down the hallway, my heart pounding. The attic door loomed above me, closed and locked, but that didn't comfort me much. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, and I almost thought I had imagined it. But then, a loud thump made me stumble back, my flashlight slipping from my hands and clattering onto the floor. The noise was coming from the attic, and it was unmistakable. I fumbled for my phone and called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the buttons. They arrived quickly, 2 officers who seemed both concerned and skeptical. One of them, a tall man with a thick mustache, led the way up to the attic. I waited at the bottom of the ladder, holding Ryan close to me, his little body trembling. The officer disappeared into the darkness, his flashlight beam cutting across the dusty attic. I held my breath, listening to the silence stretch unbearably long. Finally, he reappeared, looking confused. "There's nothing up there," he said, brushing cobwebs from his uniform. "No sign of anyone." I wanted to feel relieved, but the unease only grew. The officers left after a final sweep of the house, leaving me with a list of numbers to call if anything else happened. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, every creak and groan of the house making my skin crawl. The days passed, and the sounds kept coming. Some nights it was the scratching, other nights the dragging footsteps. Ryan grew quieter, more withdrawn, and he stopped sleeping through the night entirely. One evening, while I was doing laundry in the basement, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A small, grimy handprint smeared on the inside of one of the attic windows. I didn't wait to find out more. I packed a bag for Ryan and me that very night and stayed with my sister while I sorted things out with the landlord. When a professional team finally came to inspect the attic, they discovered evidence that someone had been living up there. A nest of old blankets, food wrappers, and a beaten-up, torn photograph of a family that wasn't mine. The police never found whoever it was, but I didn't care. We never went back to that house. Ryan still talks about the man with the hungry eyes sometimes, but I always tell him the same thing. We're safe now. At least, I hope we are. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend escape. My girlfriend Emily and I had been looking forward to this hiking trip for weeks. A chance to unplug from the world, to breathe in the fresh mountain air, and lose ourselves in nature. The first day went by in a blur of laughter and breathtaking views. We pitched our tent in a small clearing, cooked dinner over a campfire, and fell asleep under a sky full of stars. But on the second day, something changed. We were making our way deeper into the woods, the morning sun filtering through the leaves, when I started to feel it. At first, it was just a nagging sensation, like being watched from a distance. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the forest playing tricks on me. But Emily noticed too. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her smile fading as the unease settled in. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, stopping in her tracks. I hadn't heard anything at first, but then, as we both stood there holding our breath, the sound reached us, rustling in the underbrush, not far from where we were. We exchanged a nervous glance. It could have been an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon, but something about it felt different, deliberate. "Probably just wildlife," I said, forcing a smile, though the tightness in my chest wouldn't ease. We continued on, trying to laugh off our nerves, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. An hour later, we came across something that made our blood run cold. It was a small arrangement of sticks and stones, carefully constructed into a strange symbol, a circle with an X running through it. Emily bent down, examining it. "Who the hell makes something like this?" she asked, her voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. It was unsettling, and worse, it felt fresh, as if it had been made just recently. We pressed on, but the atmosphere grew heavier with every step. The woods, which had felt alive and welcoming the day before, now felt oppressive, the trees leaning in like silent watchers. As the afternoon wore on, the rustling sounds returned, this time louder, coming from multiple directions. We kept glancing at each other, our pace quickening. Then we heard it. The unmistakable snap of a twig, followed by the low murmur of voices. Real voices. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound confident, though my voice wavered. There was no reply, only a brief silence, followed by more rustling. Emily grabbed my hand, her grip tight, and we began to walk faster, almost jogging now, not caring if we looked like paranoid city folk who couldn't handle a simple hike. We didn't speak, not until we stumbled upon the second arrangement of sticks and stones, this one even more elaborate, with feathers and bone fragments woven in. Emily let out a strangled gasp, and I pulled her closer, feeling the weight of dread settle on us. This wasn't just someone's strange art project. It felt like a warning. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice hushed. Emily didn't argue. We turned back, retracing our steps as quickly as we could. But no matter how far we went, we couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following us. The rustling never stopped, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting shadows that made everything more terrifying. Just when we thought things couldn't get worse, we heard the laughter. It was soft at first, echoing through the trees, then growing louder, more sinister. Emily's face went pale, and I could feel her hand trembling in mine. "Run," I whispered, and we did. We sprinted through the woods, branches whipping at our faces and tearing at our clothes. The laughter followed us, bouncing through the trees, growing closer and more menacing. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but adrenaline kept me going. Emily stumbled, and I pulled her up, refusing to slow down. The trailhead couldn't have been more than a mile away, but it felt like an eternity. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows deepening until we could barely see. Just as my mind began to spin with panic, we burst into a clearing, gasping for air. The laughter stopped. Silence. Crushing, suffocating silence. We stood there, clutching each other, our chests heaving, waiting for whatever was out there to make its move. But nothing came. The woods were eerily still, as if holding their breath. Emily and I didn't speak as we ran the rest of the way to the trailhead. We reached our car just as the last of the daylight disappeared, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. We didn't stop until we were miles away, back in civilization, surrounded by streetlights and the familiar noise of the world. The graveyard shift at our call center was always the hardest. The hours between midnight and 6 a.m. dragged on endlessly, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with a low hum that made it feel like time itself was standing still. Most of the calls that came in were routine. Confused people trying to pay their bills, lonely night owls just wanting someone to talk to, or the occasional drunk dialing the wrong number. I had been working there for nearly 3 years, and by now, I'd heard it all. Or so I thought. It was a little past 2 a.m. when my headset crackled, and a new call flashed onto my screen. Unknown number. I sighed, preparing myself for another prank or a misdial. "Thank you for calling Express Solutions. This is Alex. How may I assist you tonight?" I recited, trying to inject some life into my tired voice. There was a pause. Dead air. I glanced at my computer, thinking the call had dropped, when I heard a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but clear enough to send a shiver down my spine. "Help me," the voice said. It sounded like a woman, and there was a raw, desperate edge to her words. "Please. He's coming." I sat up straight, my heart thudding in my chest. "Ma'am," I said, my voice tightening. "Are you in danger? Do you need emergency services?" Another pause, and the line crackled with static. "I'm trapped. He's here. I don't know where I am," she whispered, and then her voice broke into sobs. A cold fear settled over me. This didn't feel like a prank. "Can you tell me your location?" I asked, trying to stay calm. I gestured for my supervisor, Mark, who was sitting across the room. He gave me a questioning look and walked over. The woman's sobbing grew quieter, and then I heard something that made my blood freeze. Heavy, dragging footsteps, like boots scraping across a rough floor. The woman's breath hitched, and she lowered her voice to a trembling whisper. "He's coming." "Ma'am, stay calm," I said, though my own voice was shaking. "Can you describe where you are? Anything you can see or hear?" Mark was standing beside me now, listening with a furrowed brow. There was a long, terrible silence. I strained to hear, but all that came through was a faint hum of static, like the call was slipping away. And then, a new sound broke through, a guttural, wheezing noise, like someone struggling to breathe. The woman gasped, and the line went dead. "Alex, what's going on?" Mark asked, his hand resting on my shoulder. I explained what I'd heard, and Mark's face grew serious. "Could have been a real emergency," he said. "We should report it." He made a call to the local police, and I tried to shake off the eerie feeling clinging to me like a shadow. I wanted to believe it was a one-off, just a coincidence, or maybe a terrible prank. But an hour later, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I swallowed hard, my hand hesitating over the mouse. Mark noticed my hesitation and nodded for me to pick up. "Express Solutions, this is Alex," I answered, my voice barely steady. The same woman's voice came through, broken and desperate. "Please, don't let him find me," she begged. "I'm so cold. It's so dark here." "Ma'am," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "Where are you? Can you see anything that might help us locate you?" A low, scraping noise came through, and I realized it sounded like fingernails on metal. My heart raced as the woman's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's watching me," she said. "He never stops." I gestured wildly at Mark, who was already back on the line with the police. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of my desk. "We're getting help for you," I told her. "Please, hold on." The scraping noise stopped, and for a moment, there was only the faint sound of her breathing. Then, in a voice that was almost inhuman, someone, or something, whispered through the line, "You can't save her." The line went dead again. I sat there, stunned, my heart pounding so loudly, it hurt. Mark was staring at me, pale and tense. "They're tracing the call," he said, though we both knew how unlikely it was that they'd find anything. The police promised to look into it, but when they called us back an hour later, they had nothing. No trace of the call, no reports of missing women in the area, nothing at all. The rest of my shift crawled by, each minute feeling like an eternity. Every time my phone rang, I flinched, expecting that same unknown number. But it didn't come again. Not that night. The next day, I tried to forget about it, but the woman's voice haunted me. I heard it in the echo of footsteps in the parking garage, in the rustle of leaves outside my window. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, somewhere, trapped in the darkness she'd described. A week later, just as I was beginning to convince myself that it had all been some sick joke, the call center received a package addressed to me. I opened it with Mark watching over my shoulder, a sense of dread coiling in my gut. Inside was a single piece of paper, yellowed and torn. Scrawled across it in jagged letters were 4 words: "You can't save her." We called the police again, but they never found anything, and I never answered another unknown number for as long as I worked there. Some nights, when the office was quiet and the world felt too still, I'd catch myself listening, waiting for a whisper that never came, but always felt far too close. It was late, later than I should have been out walking. But my dog, Bruno, a big, gentle German shepherd, had been whining at the door, desperate to stretch his legs. I clipped his leash on, and we set off down our quiet suburban street, the autumn air crisp and cool. The neighborhood was peaceful, most of the houses dark, with only the occasional porch light casting long, eerie shadows across the sidewalk. Bruno trotted happily beside me, his tail swishing back and forth. He was my protector, my faithful shadow, and I never felt unsafe when he was around. But that night, something felt off. Bruno's ears perked up, and he slowed his pace, his body tensing. "What is it, boy?" I asked, my voice low. He pulled at the leash, sniffing the air, and let out a soft growl. I frowned, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. It was probably a raccoon or a stray cat, I thought. But Bruno didn't relax. His growl deepened, and his hackles stood on end. We'd reached the small park at the end of our street, a place we visited often during the day. But at night, it felt different, empty and ominous, the playground equipment casting monstrous shapes in the moonlight. Bruno stopped completely, his body stiff as a board, and fixed his gaze on the thick line of trees that bordered the park. I followed his stare, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the trees. My breath caught in my throat. The person was standing perfectly still, partially obscured by the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a man, tall and motionless, as if watching us. My heart started to pound, and I tugged on Bruno's leash. "Let's go, boy," I whispered, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Bruno didn't budge. He stayed rooted to the spot, his growl turning into a low, guttural snarl, the kind of sound I'd never heard him make before. The figure moved, not toward us, but sideways, slipping deeper into the shadows of the trees. I barely had time to register the movement before Bruno lunged, nearly pulling me off my feet. He barked furiously, the sound echoing through the empty park. "Bruno, no!" I shouted, tightening my grip on the leash. My dog was strong, and it took every ounce of strength I had to hold him back. He was in full guard mode, his body straining forward, teeth bared, eyes wild. The figure had vanished, but I didn't wait to see if they'd come back. I yanked on Bruno's leash and started back toward home, my legs trembling with adrenaline. Bruno kept looking over his shoulder, growling and barking, as if he could still sense the presence lurking in the darkness. We made it back to the house, and I locked the door behind us, my hands shaking. Bruno paced in front of the window, his ears still pinned back, his growl rumbling in his chest. I peeked through the curtains, half expecting to see that figure standing in my yard, but the street was empty. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was just some weirdo cutting through the park. Maybe Bruno had overreacted. But as I stood there, reassuring myself, Bruno stopped pacing. He froze in front of the window, his growl abruptly silencing, and his body went rigid. I followed his gaze, and my stomach dropped. The front porch light cast a wide circle of illumination outside. But now there was someone, standing just at the edge of it, half shrouded in darkness. The same tall, unmoving figure from the park. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. Bruno exploded into another round of furious barking, throwing himself at the window. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Panic flooded my mind. I grabbed my phone, hands fumbling to dial 911. The operator picked up, and I tried to explain what was happening, my voice a frantic whisper. As I spoke, the figure stepped forward, into the light, and I finally saw him clearly. He wore a dark hoodie, the shadow of the hood obscuring most of his face. But the thing that stood out, the thing that made my blood run cold, was the way his mouth was twisted into a grin, wide and unnatural. "Please hurry," I begged the operator, my voice cracking. Bruno's barking grew more intense, and suddenly he turned and sprinted down the hallway toward the back of the house. My heart lurched. There was no way anyone could have gotten back there, right? The doors were locked, the windows shut. But Bruno was acting as if. A loud crash came from the back of the house, and Bruno's barking turned into a savage, furious snarl. I dropped the phone and ran after him, adrenaline flooding my veins. When I reached the back door, I found it wide open, the lock shattered. Bruno was gone, charging into the darkness, chasing something, or someone I couldn't see. "Bruno!" I screamed, but he didn't come back. The police arrived minutes later, lights flashing, but it felt like an eternity. They searched the neighborhood, combed the park, even brought in a K9 unit. But there was no trace of Bruno. No sign of the man in the hoodie. Just the broken lock on my back door, and my world turned upside down. I never found out who the man was, or why he was watching my house. And I never saw Bruno again. Some nights, though, I think I hear his barking in the distance, fierce and protective, like he's still out there somewhere, keeping the darkness at bay. The first time I noticed him, I didn't think much of it. He was just another new face in our sprawling office, a low-level associate in a different department. I only knew his name because our HR manager introduced him during a company-wide meeting, Nathan. He had a nondescript look about him, with plain, dark hair and glasses. If you'd asked me what he wore that day, I wouldn't have been able to tell you. But a few weeks in, Nathan became impossible to ignore. It was small things at first, the way he always seemed to be around, even when he shouldn't be. I'd walk into the break room for coffee, and he'd be there, standing by the counter, staring at me a moment too long before offering a bland smile. Or I'd be in the elevator, and he'd slip in at the last second, pressing the button for my floor, even though his department was 2 floors up. Once, I caught him in the lobby, sitting on one of the benches outside. He looked surprised when I noticed him, as if he hadn't expected to be seen. He waved, and I forced myself to wave back, though the pit in my stomach told me something was off. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overreacting. After all, offices are full of people who just end up crossing paths. It was bound to happen in a building full of cubicles and shared spaces. But I couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was more than coincidental. Then came the messages. They started appearing on my desk, handwritten on small sticky notes. At first, they were harmless enough. "You looked nice today" was the first one, left next to my keyboard. I asked around, thinking it was a joke from one of my coworkers, but everyone seemed genuinely puzzled. Then came a note that sent a shiver down my spine. "I love how you laugh at your screen when you think no one's watching." I found that one on a Monday morning, and it made me sick to my stomach. It was so specific, so intimate, like someone had been observing me in my most vulnerable moments. I stuffed the note into my purse and tried to shake it off, but a creeping paranoia settled in. From that day on, I started to notice more. The way Nathan would linger outside my cubicle, pretending to check his phone. How he'd be in the parking lot just a little too often, usually sitting in his car with the engine running. Once, I came back from the restroom to find him standing near my desk, his eyes darting away as soon as he saw me. "Oh, hey," he said, his voice too casual. "Just waiting for someone." But the worst incident happened on a Friday night. I'd stayed late to finish up a project, the office eerily quiet, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. I was the only one left in my department, or so I thought. Around 9 p.m., I heard footsteps echoing down the hall. My heart raced, and I glanced up, expecting to see a cleaning crew or someone who'd forgotten their keys. Instead, it was Nathan. He stood there, just outside the pool of light cast by my desk lamp. His glasses reflected the glow, obscuring his eyes. "Working late?" he asked, his voice echoing in the empty space. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my cool. "Yeah," I said, my fingers freezing on the keyboard. "You too?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his shoes making a soft squeak on the linoleum floor. "I've noticed you've been working late a lot," he said, his voice strangely familiar, as if we were friends. "You should be careful. You never know who might be watching." Every hair on my neck stood up. I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Yeah, well, I'm heading out soon," I said, grabbing my bag and trying to keep my hands from shaking. Nathan's smile didn't reach his eyes. He stepped aside, making a show of letting me pass, and I practically bolted for the elevator. I didn't breathe until I was inside my car. The doors locked, and I sped out of the parking lot. That weekend, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd let it go too far. The anxiety gnawed at me, twisting my gut in knots. When Monday rolled around, I decided enough was enough. I went straight to HR, bringing the sticky notes I'd kept and explaining everything. To my surprise, the HR manager took it seriously. She called security, and together we went through Nathan's file. What they found was disturbing. Nathan had no alibi for several late nights he'd spent lurking in the building. Security footage confirmed he'd been hovering around my desk area, even when he had no reason to be there. My pulse raced as they assured me that they would handle it, that they'd report him and escalate the issue. But Nathan wasn't done. That evening, as I was leaving the building, I felt the prickling sensation of being watched. Sure enough, Nathan was there, standing by his car, arms folded. He didn't approach me, but the way he stared made my skin crawl. I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling, and called the police. It was the hardest 2 weeks of my life, waiting for HR and the authorities to do something. But eventually, a restraining order was issued, and Nathan was terminated. The day he was escorted out, I watched from a window as security led him to his car. He glanced back, and our eyes met. His gaze was cold, devoid of any regret or remorse. But it didn't end there. For weeks, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every sound at night, every shadow outside my window, made me jump. But gradually, I started to feel safe again. I changed my routines, took self-defense classes, and made sure I was never alone late at the office. Eventually, I found out that Nathan had skipped town, moving back to his home state. But the fear he left behind lingered, a scar I carried with me. It changed me, made me more cautious, but it also made me stronger. I'd resolved not to let the memory of a stalker rule my life, but I would never forget the way his eyes had followed me, the way he'd made me feel small and afraid. In the end, I kept one of the sticky notes, the first harmless one. "You looked nice today." I tucked it into the back of a drawer, a reminder of how things can seem innocent until they aren't, and of how important it is to listen to your instincts when something or someone feels very, very wrong.